Geoffrey Hale. Geoffrey joins us from the Department of Homeland Security. Geoffrey is kind enough to come talk to us about the work that DHS did during this election, and then perhaps more importantly to discuss the designation of election systems as critical infrastructure. And so Geoffrey will discuss that, and then we'll open for questions, of which I'm sure there are many. And Geoffrey, it's no surprise to you, the election community eagerly awaits being able to ask some of these questions and begin to have this conversation around what this designation means. So I appreciate you being here.
Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, again, I'm Geoff Hale from the Department of Homeland Security. We are, in my mind, still a young agency, although getting to the point where I could stop saying that. These are our 5 core missions. I've highlighted the one that I work in, safeguarding and securing cyberspace. My overall organization is the National Protection and Programs Directorate. We work in resilience for cyber and physical infrastructure. In the corner here, and there's a larger graphic of this later, there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors which we serve. How we do our cyber mission is we have direct capabilities aligned to protect the federal civilian executive branch IT networks. We provide the private sector, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments with expertise and some services to help manage their cyber risk. And in the case of an incident, we have teams that we can deploy to help you recover and restore your networks. So for that second one, the services, information, and assistance that we provide to state and local governments, we focus the areas on identifying and limiting vulnerabilities, assessing threats and sharing relevant information, and applying security expertise and best practices. And again, there's flyaway teams to stand next to you and assist if necessary. I did this slide the last time I was here because I feel like we always have to explain why is DHS here now. We have been working for, I guess, as long as we've existed with state CIOs, or Chief Information Officers, and Information Security Officers. And as the Commissioner continues to say, elections are becoming more and more like IT managers. So we want to make sure that as IT managers, you are aware of the services that we already provide to states and local governments through the CIO and CISO shops, and that those are also available to you. So some of those services, we went around providing, I believe I spoke in September about, this was our primary push, was the Cyber Hygiene program. It's a no-cost, remote, recurring, uncredentialed scan of internet-facing systems. So for the vast majority of stakeholders, that does not include voting systems, that does include perhaps online VRDBs. And so this is a very kind of fundamental scan of what an adversary might see. We had 33 states sign up for this between September and Election Day. We had 36 local governments do it as well. We just for elections. We've also had private sector, vendors, academia, media, all in the push for better election assurances. These scans are actually rooted in a vulnerability and configuration error database that NIST hosts. Many of the states that chose not to use this service said they have a similar capability in-house. Some states had that as well and chose to use us just as a verification tool. This was the main push because we got into the election space so late. we knew there was very little as far as policies or actual structural opportunities for change. So this was something that you could protect a server or internet-facing infrastructure fairly quickly. It's a routine task for an IT manager. We have a more in-depth risk and vulnerability assessment. This is the one that we'll have a team that takes the first week to try to exploit your networks from afar, and then the next week goes on site, does the kind of cute tricks of leaving USB sticks in the parking lot, and you'd be shocked how many people will actually stick that into your network. Yeah, social engineering. There's operating system scanning. This is the one that gets a really detailed look of how your network can be penetrated and exploited. Because these have to be scheduled ahead of time, only one existed before for election systems before the election. We've got several in the queue now. There is a 9-month wait for the general private sector to request this, but there's always priority given to critical infrastructure, so we can get these done faster. This is another assessment that focuses more on policy. We did not push these for that reason I gave. There are very few opportunities to alter policy between September and Election Day, so I don't even think I mentioned this. We have field-based personnel that can come sit with your chief risk officer, your CEOs, walk through some of the best practices and policies that take place. This aligns to the NIST framework. DHS loves the NIST cybersecurity framework. We find it's almost the best Rosetta Stone for your IT manager to talk to a CEO. It's about the only opportunity they could speak the same language. This can also be done as a self-assessment. We have our tools and services available on our website that I'll show later, that you can walk through and check off that you're performing these policy duties and best practices. The regionally based personnel that I just described are cybersecurity advisors and protective security advisors. They are responsible for making themselves available to the private sector, to state and local governments, assisting in any way. These are not law enforcement. They are not incident responders. They are subject matter experts that you can sit with at your location and understand what the rest of the country is doing. So that kind of covered the opportunities to identify and address vulnerabilities. On the threat and information sharing side, we run the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. This is kind of in the nexus between law enforcement information, the intelligence community, the private sector, and of course the federal government. And with all these feeds, this produces analysis and reports to share with, in this case, critical infrastructure sectors on actionable ways to reduce their exposure to risk. We've produced a best practices document on voter registration databases. There were threat and information briefings. And of course, the secretary has produced public comments on the security of elections that all kind of were distributed through this channel. The NKIC, which was that location, is also an incident response. So this is not the most important thing for this discussion, but in case you have a problem, you can reach us via these means, and we will help you restore your asset to the best of our ability. There's also a multi-state information sharing and analysis center that is grant funded by DHS to perform the information sharing duties and and incident response for state and local governments. It gives a little more tailored look and filters out things that might be affecting the private sector that don't apply. Summarizing those services in one neat table in case you want to show anyone else. When we, at meeting DHS, kind of burst through the door into the election community, we're using the term election infrastructure, and I'm not exactly sure that necessarily resonates with the community at large. We use infrastructure to mean everything. All the supporting networks, assets, people, systems, critical to enabling a process, in this case, the election process. So we are talking about storage facilities, polling places, tabulation, VRDBs and voting systems, and the rest of the information technology and infrastructure used to manage the elections. This would include election night reporting systems. This would include election management systems. What's not on here is party, so we don't consider that election infrastructure right now. That's politically affiliated. The election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, obviously in early January, the then Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, established election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, a subsector within the government facilities sector. He did identify my parent organization as the sector-specific agency. That really just means we are responsible to responding to you right now. The way to understand critical infrastructure is, in this case, it was the belief that affecting election systems would have such a debilitating effect on public confidence and potentially affect the peaceful transition of power. This was one of the reasons that DHS determined that systems and assets in election infrastructure would qualify as critical infrastructure. Again, here are the other sectors. So, what does designation mean? We've discussed you already get priority in all of the other services that are offered publicly. This would also create coordination mechanisms, entirely voluntary, that would be able to discuss threat information at a greater level of depth and with protections that allow candid discussion across the table. We find that there are some stakeholders who don't really care about threat. They don't need attribution. They want let us know if it's a big baddie or a small baddie or what type of adversary we're facing. Are they well resourced or not? What we find more often than not, though, is a measure of the persistence of an adversary can impact decision making more significantly than attributing to this character or that. Some of those information sharing protections I was referring to include the CPAC protections that allow you to, for government officials, this is kind of more relevant, to come bring in expertise to the table and have them discuss, analyze your system, let you know what might be problematic without this necessarily being available to FOIA or state sunshine laws. This allows you to address those vulnerabilities in a timely manner before they can be exploited. Everyone knows the pace of government is a lot slower than the pace of media, so this is what that's trying to address. Protected critical infrastructure information is another protection that vendors and owners and operators of critical infrastructure systems can share information with DHS. This information is protected from civil use and civil litigation, regulatory use, FOIA requests, state sunshine laws, and it's not just, you can't submit your entire source code potentially, but if you do come out with potentially a patch, you can share that and say, I need to get this to my clients as quickly as possible. If one state knows this, knows of a vulnerability and wishes to share it with other states they know use the system, this allows for that information to be shared again rapidly without hopefully preempting any opportunity for someone to exploit that vulnerability. Those two were protections that really assist you in identifying and addressing vulnerabilities. Again, to work to the threat side of the equation, this designation allows for election officials to attain security clearances. That allows us to get to a greater level of depth in the threat conversation. Again, threat and persistence seems to affect decision making. And there are also policy protections. Now, this is perhaps a little bureaucratic, but being critical infrastructure, there are a set of international norms that say these countries agree that don't step on these critical infrastructure networks, otherwise, or don't attack these networks, otherwise it's considered an act of non-peacetime. That also enables us to use particular executive orders to hold potential adversaries that do step on these networks accountable. This was amended and used in late December of this past year to identify 30-some actors, and the Secretary of Treasury pointed to certain individuals, foreign individuals that are now limited in their ability to come to the United States. So, I'm sure you have questions.